Well, hey, everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to today's show. And joining me today is Vice Presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party, Jeremy Spike Cohen. Hello, Spike, and welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, Robert, thanks for having me on. I greatly appreciate your time.
Uh, it's probably fair to say you're not a really known quantity. So can you go ahead and talk a little bit about yourself? Who is Spike Cohen, and what is your history with the Libertarian Party?
Sure, absolutely. Hey, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in. My name is Spike Cohen. I am the Libertarian Party candidate for vice president, along with my presidential running mate, Dr. Jo Jorgensen, who has been on the Tampa Dispatch before. If you got to see that, you already know how fantastic she is. I am a serial entrepreneur. I started a web design company back in my teens, right before my 17th birthday in 1999. For the better part of 20 years, I had my company, which I grew into a very successful one, and I largely worked on helping startups start their company. Start their companies also through the creating their website design and everything else. So I indirectly and directly helped create countless companies during that time. 3 years ago, I retired from my business so that I could focus full time on my true passion, which was sharing the message of liberty to a public that often hasn't heard our ideas. And so to that end, I became the host of My Fellow Americans, the co-host of the Muddy Waters of Freedom, and the co-owner of Muddy Waters Media. We've had a very successful platform. Our reach is in the millions. We have many dedicated viewers and listeners. And after talking for a few years with Americans across the country and realizing that they hadn't heard the ideas of liberty. And more importantly, when they did hear the ideas of liberty, they had light bulb moments. They had these aha moments. They had moments of feeling hope once again that, wow, there really is a solution to all these problems we're facing. And it's not the same recycled, warmed over garbage that we keep hearing from the Republicrats over and over again. There's an actual solution based on an actual philosophy that recognizes that I own myself and that I and the people that I interact with on a daily basis know far better how to be able to solve the problems in our life if we would just be given the power back and have the barriers and burdens that the Republicrats have put in place removed so that we can thrive and seek better lives. And on the strength of that, I decided to run for vice president, using an empathetic and engaging and dynamic way of messaging to the American people that they can be free. We do not have to live like this. We can take the power back from those craven, pandering politicians and the well-heeled, politically connected billionaire cronies who own them and put it back in your hands where it always belonged. And that is what Jo and I are running on every single day.
Excellent. Since you said you want to talk about the answers that you have, I want to look at some of the things that you wrote recently to the LP of Colorado.
Okay.
You wrote, we, that's Jo and yourself, are running on a platform that is exclusively derived from the Libertarian Party platform. And you list several things, and I'd like to get some more details on, and they're all good things in my view, but I want to know exactly how you and Jo would accomplish them. And one of the things you say is our goal is to reduce the size of government as much as possible so that the national debt will stop growing and start shrinking. How would you and Dr. Jorgensen do that?
Well, the short answer is Jo has pledged that she will refuse to sign and she will veto any bill that increases the national debt. She will also refuse to sign any bill that increases revenue, how much money is being stolen from you, largely against your will. That means government will necessarily have to reduce, and we will be helping at the executive level. So Congress has so abdicated their responsibility to the executive branch over the years, creating one alphabet soup agency after the next, in order to basically not have to deal with that. That's now an executive thing. And they've created an increasingly powerful and centralized power within the White House, within the executive branch, by creating these regulatory agencies that have nearly unlimited regulatory authority and then putting the president in charge of deciding how those regulations play out on a day-to-day basis. The silver lining to that is that when Jo Jorgensen gets elected, she can just start undoing all that stuff. She can undo all of those regulations. She can unschedule those drugs. She can declare that the wars are no longer necessary because Congress never declared war. So she can simply end them and bring those troops home. She can do a lot of those things, which not only cause immediate and profound benefits to the American people in the form of fewer and fewer restrictions on their lives and fewer impositions on them, but it also necessarily reduces the day-to-day cost of the implementation of government.
You also said you'd like to abolish the IRS, and of course, this is obviously something I really love. But I've heard, well, of course, libertarians speak on this before, but I've heard a lot of Republicans in the past speak on this, and clearly it never happens. Spike, how and where would the federal government get the funding to perform the few functions they are constitutionally mandated to or allowed to do? Where would this money come from?
That's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. Now, going back to what the Libertarian platform says and what Joe and I believe, the way to fund government is through voluntary fees for services. If government is doing something that is necessary and needed, then there's a demand for it. And if there's a demand for it, then people are willing to pay for it. If they're not willing to pay for it, that means that either that thing isn't needed or that government isn't doing a good job of it and people don't want it from government, which means government should not be doing it. And if people aren't willing to pay as much as government is charging, that means government's charging too much, which means they either need to lower the cost of that thing or they need to allow others to compete in it. Now, there are some things that are not going to be able to be funded in a direct funding voluntary fee for service model. Some of the social safety nets that are in place that we are not going to get rid of on day one because that would cause immeasurable harm. And we, instead of removing those safety nets, we want to add the ladders back so that people can climb out of them and not need welfare and not need these things. We will need to, work on slowly weaning people off of things like Medicare and Social Security, mostly through attrition, but also through allowing people to opt out so that they can't. But so there are going to be some things that are going to have to be funded in the meantime. And so there have been some really ingenious ideas of how to do that. One is a voluntary transaction fee. Here's how this works, Robert. When I first heard this, I thought, oh, here comes the libertarian telling me about their tax that's going to work. Here we go. And I read it and I went, this is genius. And here's how it works. And this is not official policy. It's just an example of one of the many ways that government could fund itself in these new and ingenious ways if we take away their ability to just rob everyone at gunpoint. The way a transaction fee works is there would be a fee, say 1%, 2% on every transaction, anytime anyone buys anything. The end consumer, business to business, labor, whatever. Anytime any transaction happens, there would be, let's say, a 2% transaction fee on that. And so here's how that plays out. If I sell you a car for $1,000, okay, and we decide, because I'm such a good friend of yours, that neither of us need to pay that $20 transfer fee. I'm just going to sell it to you. We'd have every right to do that. No one would get in trouble for that. But if something was wrong with the car, you couldn't sue me. You couldn't make me, if something was wrong with the car and you said, hey, listen, this car doesn't work, it isn't what you said, and I go, I made you buy it, you'd have no recourse, right? You'd have no recourse. And so you would, because you didn't pay for the government service there. Even though the revenue that would be collected by that transaction fee would be much more than the cost of actually being able to use arbitration services from government, use the civil system, just the fact that you didn't pay it, you don't get to use it. So, it's one of those buyer beware things. Now, what that does is it incentivizes people to choose to pay it. Now, if I sell you a loaf of bread and we don't want to pay that fee, you think, hey, you know what? There's very little danger in this loaf of bread. I'm just going to go ahead and buy it. But in something a little bit bigger, you're going to be incentivized to pay that fee. And I, as a seller, in order to be able to market that I'm trustworthy, and I can prove that I'm trustworthy because I pay the transaction fee for you. That now creates a system where people are choosing to pay for government services, even though they know the revenue will be more than what the actual cost of those services are, because they want to demonstrate that they can be, held accountable if something is wrong within the government's system of arbitration and lawsuits and so forth. And that helps fund government services and things like that. So that's one of many ways that government can be voluntarily funded. Direct services for fees for services, transaction fee models. There's many ways to do it. But the short answer is that any model that is based on the government saying you have to pay this, or we will make your life ever worse and worse until you pay it, that's not a good model. That doesn't lead to good outcomes. That leads to the kind of outcomes you would expect from a protection racket. Are there any economists that have looked at this transaction fee to see how feasible it is? My understanding is that the one that was presented to me, it wasn't presented to like a congressional, the CBO or whatever it's called. It wasn't presented to an official authority, but people who have just looked at the actual like back of the book math of what would be generated from it, that it would be able to pay for. You could, I think it was with like a 3% or 4% fee, it would be enough to fund federal and state governments. But again, it would be on every single transaction. So there would be a lot of taxing happening before it ever got to the end consumer, but it would be small amounts. And it would be, and again, it would be at any point, anyone in that transaction chain could say, yeah, we don't want to pay it. And either side could choose to pay it themselves. They could choose to pay half and half, whatever they want to do, or they could choose not to pay at all. It would be entirely voluntary. They just wouldn't be able to use government services. And obviously, the less expensive government is, and the more parts of government are being funded by direct fees for services, the lower that transaction fee has to be, which means the more of a no-brainer it becomes to pay it.
Interesting stuff. Let me go ahead and switch gears to some more things that are going on around the world right now and here in the United States. And of course, I have to talk about the coronavirus pandemic.
Of course.
And one of the issues with this is really opened the doors for the citizens to allow an awful lot of government overreach that maybe they wouldn't normally go for. Spike, I'd like to get your thoughts on the response to the pandemic, both at the local, the state, and the federal level. And what would you and Joe do differently?
Well, first we have to look at the initial response and how government has a history of allowing things to get really, really, really bad and actually creating conditions for those things to get really, really bad so that they can use it as an excuse in the midst of the chaos to go, we need more control. This is why you shouldn't have control over your lives, you bunch of morons. Look at what you did. They did this with COVID. For the first 6 to 8 weeks that COVID was here, the Centers for Disease Control, the federal agency that the Republicans created to protect us from this very type of thing, banned medical professionals from testing COVID patients. This highly virulent pathogen that, left to its own devices, doubles in spread every 12 to 24 hours. They were told, any medical professional was told, you are not allowed to test COVID patients. When patients would come in and say, Doc, I'm not feeling too hot. I just got back from Wuhan, China, and I'm feeling sick, and I'm hearing about this coronavirus thing, or one of my loved ones just got back from China, and they're sick, and now I'm not feeling too hot, and I'm worried it might be this coronavirus thing. Up until like March, those doctors had to say, well, there's nothing we can do about it until the CDC gives us some kind of authority to do so. I was sick in February. And I was there for the New Hampshire primaries, and I got sick like a few days later, and I went to a doctor's office and said, I was just with a bunch of people from around the planet who came to witness the spectacle of the primaries. I'm worried I might have this coronavirus because I also tested negative for the flu. Now, later on, I got tested for the antibodies, and I don't know what I had, but it wasn't COVID. But I said, I'm worried I might have it. And they said, nothing we can do. Just act like it is. And so they told me to stay home, and they told me to, wear a mask if I had to go somewhere, and to try to have, my loved ones stay away from me until I was feeling better, and to try to, at least for a week or so, try to basically quarantine myself, which is what I did. I actually missed some campaign events in Florida and then in Kentucky because of that. But they couldn't test me to see if I actually had it because it was illegal for them to do so. And so the CDC actually created the conditions for coronavirus to run rampant across this country, which is why the United States has the worst outbreak right now of any of the developed countries on earth, because the federal government actually choked off people on the ground, doctors and nurses and practitioners on the ground who could have made these test kits, which apparently it took the CDC 2 months of trying to make their test kits before finally giving up and letting the free market do it. But doctors themselves who were illegally testing patients were able to make these test kits easily, test their patients. Some of their positive results came back positive, and they went to the CDC and said, listen, we're testing illegally and it's already here. And the CDC's initial response is, that's illegal. Destroy those test results. Do not tell the patients. Send them home. Tell them nothing. That's why it's as bad as it is here.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty closely involved with the coronavirus pandemic with my 9 to 5. That's very interesting.
Yeah. If you look up Dr. Helen Chu, she was one of the doctors at the University of Seattle Medical Center in Washington, or University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle, Washington. She's one of the ones that tested illegally. And thanks to her and some other people engaging in civil disobedience, testing patients and then releasing the results to the public. That's what forced the CDC's hand to allow medical professionals to start testing. Imagine if they had done that back in January.
Yeah. Well,
I know that much better situation.
Well, I know they botched the production of the test.
Yeah.
And couldn't get the test out there, and that held back the mega labs like Quest and LabCorp from getting their stuff out there. Which,
yep.
So that was a really bad thing there. But your story there is something I haven't heard. I'll have to do some research on that.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead and switch gears, Spike. Again, this is kind of controversial too, because in a Reason article, you're familiar with Reason magazine, I'm sure. Jo Jorgensen recently showed support for the Black Lives Matter protest. But I want to be clear that she warned against opportunistic people hijacking the movement.
Of course.
Now, this is an incredibly complex issue in many ways. I'd like to get your thoughts on the protests, the obvious riots, and the movement in general. The actions of the inactions of mayors and governors, and what the feds did. What would a Jorgensen Cohen administration do, or maybe not do, in as these cities burn, basically?
So what we would do is end the security theater and the out-of-control militarized police state that led to these conditions in the first place, and undo these policies so that the rift between the police and the public can heal. Let's look at the conditions that led to this. We're dealing with decades, centuries really, but decades of police actions against all of us that are increasingly unaccountable, thanks to qualified immunity, thanks to the war on drugs, thanks to protections from police unions, and various other actions that have led to police to be increasingly out of any kind of accountability, which disincentivizes good policing, encourages bad policing. Qualified immunity. Imagine you could walk into a court and say, Your Honor, I know I've been accused of murder, but I think what I did was perfectly reasonable. And the judge goes, oh, okay, well, if you think it's reasonable, I'll drop the charges. That's qualified immunity. And qualified immunity leads to the kind of bad policing that we often see in our communities, especially disproportionately in marginalized communities like communities of color. And that has led to these protests. Unfortunately, many of these protests were unarmed initially. And because they were unarmed, the police could treat those protesters however they wished. And so what they did was they would often cordon these protesters off in specific areas, concentrate all of their forces in them, and then start unleashing tear gas and pepper balls on them and violating their habeas corpus rights and detaining them indefinitely, illegally, without any charges. There are some in New York who are still being held after several weeks. No charges, just being held. And so in creating those conditions, that led to those protests becoming riots. You went there to protest police brutality. You are now being brutalized by the police. There's tear gas going all over the place, which is a violation of the Geneva Convention in any other country, but it's being done to you here because you dared to speak out against police violence. And now it becomes a riot. What they also did is they left the entire rest of the city unpoliced, which allows for looters and opportunists to come in and go after business owners who in many of these cities, thanks to gun control, are unable to enforce and protect themselves. And now the conditions for chaos have been created both by the initial conditions of protests that happened as a result of police action, of bad police action, and were fostered and made worse by the police response to the protests. And then, not coincidentally, those same police departments and governments turn around and go, look at all this chaos that happened. They're trying to take away our power. We need more power because we're the thin blue line between you and the chaos on the streets that we created. And we need more power. We need more military equipment. We need more of your money. We need more officers. We need less accountability. It's security theater. And then it ends with the coup de grace of federal troops in the streets arresting American citizens and detaining them without charge. That is the logical conclusion of security theater. It plays out time and time again. We get blowback, and then we get additional growth of increasingly authoritarian government in response to the blowback that was created by the conditions that they set. The answer is to stop the cycle, to end the militarization of the police state, to end the war on drugs, to end qualified immunity so that police officers are held to the same standard that you and me and anyone else, that if they do wrong, they can be held accountable for it. What a novel idea. And then as the rift between the police and the public they serve begins to heal, now there are less reasons and needs for these protests in the first place. We also end the war on guns so that people can protect themselves in any kind of conditions.
Mhm.
So there are many facets of what we do, but the short answer is we decentralize. We get the federal government out of policing. They should have never been involved in that in the first place. It is not an enumerated power in the Constitution. They are not contributing to public order or decency or anything else. They are making the conditions worse because a centralized federal authority should have no say in what your community's police look like. And that is where the problem started. And so we end that and we put the power of the policing back in the hands of those communities. They can look like whatever those communities want. And that solves a lot of the problems. That deals with 90 to 95% of what Black Lives Matter protesters are protesting about on a given day.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said in theory, but I just want to make it clear to the audience, you are not for these local officials, these mayors and all that, keeping the police held back from stopping people obviously looting and destroying businesses.
No, of course not. No. And,
Right.
and what they're doing is intentional. This is intentional. They're going, no, focus on the protesters. Don't bother these fine looters over here. And then they turn around and go, look at all this chaos in the streets. We need more police. We need more power and control. It is intentional. Of course we're against it. That's what the police should be doing. The police are supposed to protect our lives, our rights, and our property. And that's it. They're not supposed to be telling us what we can be putting on our bodies. They're not supposed to be kneeling on our necks while our hands are behind our backs and waiting for us to die while people beg them to stop. They're not supposed to be giving us a hard time over, whether our license plate is mildly obstructed or we got a crack in our tail light and they give us a multi-$100 fine that is a terrible inconvenience to most of us, and for many of us ruins them financially for weeks and months. That is not the role of the police. The police are a group of armed people whose presumed role is to protect our lives and our rights and our property. And we see across the country where they are doing the opposite at the direct behest of the craven, pandering politicians who have control over them, at the behest of the crony corporations and billionaires who sponsor them. They want these conditions. They don't have to live in these conditions. They live in the safest communities with their own private security. They want these conditions for us so that we sign off on more of our rights being taken away and more of our money being taken away and more of our power being taken away to stop the chaos. It is all theater. It needs to end.
Okay, I know we're getting a little short on time, so I had several other questions, but let me ask this one.
Sure.
The last one. How is the Jorgensen-Cohen ticket different from the Gary Johnson-Bill Weld ticket of 2016?
So I don't want to throw Gary and Bill under the bus. I will say that for a couple of election cycles, the Libertarian Party chose a strategy of bringing in what they saw as more well-known characters, people that were previous Republican politicians, governors and congressmen with Bob Barr and so forth. And they would bring them in. And they were libertarian on quite a few issues, and they were not libertarian on some other issues, and they made no bones about it. We are not principled, or we are not, philosophical libertarians. We agree with a lot of the libertarian platform, and we would like to, lend ourselves to help, lend some cachet or credibility. You can decide whether that strategy was successful or not. I leave it up to you. I'm not going to say negative things. I will say that Bill Weld was a bridge too far for me, and I'll leave it at that. But Gary, I had no problem with Gary. Here's what I will say about me and Joe. We are libertarians. We are down the line libertarians. And where that matters is that the goal of the Libertarian Party is to contest and win elections. And most importantly, in doing so, to put forward ideas that are not coming out of the other parties, and to change the cultural conversation away from ever-growing tyranny and towards the idea that we need to have our rights and our power and our money back, that the problem is those politicians and those cronies, that we're not going to get solutions from them. And that requires us to be in both our ethos and our praxis down the line libertarians who have a default libertarian, philosophically libertarian response to all of these problems, because that keeps us consistent. It makes us bold. It makes us have a completely different message than what the American people have heard from any other politician. And it creates the conditions for people to say, you know what? The Republicans and Democrats suck so much, and there's so little difference between them. I'm going to vote for this third party, and I don't even care if they win. They're the only ones who sound like anything that I would even want. And that's what we do. We bring people in. We meet them where they are from in their spaces and in their pretenses, we using their nomenclature, and we meet them where they are, and we reflect back that we're listening to them, and we validate their concerns, because the vast majority of people are not sociopaths. Whatever their policy prescriptions are, they come from legitimate places of concern. We validate their concerns, and then when we reflect back that we actually understand what's going on, we can take them on the journey for how libertarianism works. And you cannot do that if you are not a down the line philosophical libertarian who is able to articulate in an empathetic and engaging and dynamic way those messages and those solutions for how we're going to fix the problems the Republicans and Democrats have created. And that is what Dr. Jorgensen and I represent.
Yeah, and I really believe that a lot of libertarians are happy to see this ticket, because it doesn't involve former Republicans and, I mean, philosophically not totally on board. I guess that's what I meant to say.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I used to be a Republican. Now, Joe was not. Joe was a lifetime libertarian. I used to be a neocon. Like 15 years ago, I was a neocon. Yeah. But I get what you're saying, bringing in people who are not philosophically libertarian. It doesn't mean like a purity test, although Joe and I are pretty much 100% libertarian. But it means having a philosophical ethos built around the ideas behind libertarianism, the foundational, fundamental basics of libertarianism, and that's what we represent. And unfortunately, I do have to jump off to another interview, but hopefully I can come back on soon.
Absolutely.
For a longer interview. And I hope I got to answer a good number of your questions. And if anyone liked what they heard, I invite you to join us at joe20.com. And there's a volunteer form you can fill out. We'd love you to join we are building a grassroots army for human liberty, and we are fighting to set America free. And we believe that our time is now.
Excellent. Thank you, Spike Cohen. Have a great day, sir.
Thank you, Robert. Have a good night.
All right. Good night.